Hey guys, welcome to another video. Um, so, whatever I've come down with is getting better, but I am a little bit out of it still. So, pay no mind to the occasional cough, as bad as it is. Anyway, let's talk about Stephen King. That's why you clicked on the link. That's why you clicked on the video. So, I can't believe this. This is the first Stephen King novel to appear on the Crazy Nut Reviews platform. The Crazy Nut Reviews project as a whole has been largely Stephen King free. And it's kind of funny because Carrie was his debut novel, which is what we're covering today. Or tonight, I guess. So the book was written in 1974, or written and published in 1974, if I remember correctly. But apparently, Stephen King himself he hated the book and he threw away the early draft of the manuscript, and his wife apparently dug them out of the trash and had him keep going, which is kind of how Carrie ended up, being what it is. So yeah, it's kind of fitting. It's the first appearance of Stephen King on Crazy Nut Reviews, and I'm covering his first novel, his debut novel. Well, my experiences, I've read a couple of Stephen King's books. My very first kind of exposure to Stephen King was when I believe I was about 13 or 14 years old, and I went to the local library and I took out a copy of the Tommyknockers, and I read it, and it was okay, but at the end of it I was kind of like, okay, what was the point of reading this thing? The ending was disturbing, but it was more confusing than disturbing. And oh, excuse me. But yeah, it was more a confusing ending than anything else. And excuse me. If I'm not coughing, I'm yawning. If I'm not yawning, I'm sneezing. Oh man, I can't wait for this cold to go away. But I finished the Tommyknockers, and it was kind of a disappointment. So I thought, well, that's the last time I'm going to read a Stephen King novel. It's like, one bad experience. And I thought, you know what? I hated that book. I'm never going to touch another Stephen King novel. Which, obviously, since we're talking about Carrie, it wasn't the last Stephen King novel. But a few years later, my mom and I were talking about Stephen King novels and things like that. And she subsequently went and picked up It, Cujo, and Salem's Lot. And before I did actually read something else before I read. From those three, I started with It, and then I moved on to Salem's Lot, and then I moved on to Cujo, and all three books, scared me senseless to a point. I thought Cujo was more of a tragic story than anything else, but oh man, this is terrible. But I thought Cujo was more a tragedy than anything else. It was scary, and Salem's Lot was, yeah, it was scary at times, but most of the time you're just going, well, who's the vampire gonna feed on next, kind of thing. Now, before I read It, I read one other Stephen King novel called Misery. And, well, I didn't sleep very well for the next 3 months. I can tell you that much. That was one of the most unsettling reads I had ever gone through at the time. So I was like, oh, man, maybe Stephen King is actually worth reading. And I moved on to It a little while after that, and I did Salem's Lot, and I read Cujo, and I've read a couple of his other things as well. But yeah, Cycle of the Werewolf is one that I read as well, and then Carrie, of course. So yeah, it's kind of just my experience with it. Some of his, it's kind of a hit and miss. Some of his books are really good, and some of them are kind of meh. And then you get books like Carrie, which it kind of falls into this weird kind of middle ground, where on the one hand it's really good and you have like genuine scares, and then on the other hand, you compare it to books like Misery and It and Salem's Lot and what's that series? The Dark Tower, and you look at Carrie in comparison to this, and you go, did he really write that? So I don't think I need to go into the plot, but if you haven't read it, and I think most people will have read Carrie at least once by now, but for those who haven't read it, and I'm going to try not to spoil it for the guys who haven't read it, there will be spoilers, obviously, but I'm going to try and keep them to a minimum. Carrie White is like this outcast. She is socially awkward. She lives with her crazy, ultra religious mother, who basically just, makes her life miserable. And at one point she develops psychic abilities. She develops these psychic abilities and has to kind of come to grips with them. Now, like I said, that's kind of the plot. She gets these psychic abilities and basically goes on a rampage. There's a prank that goes wrong. Obviously, everybody who knows anything about Carrie, even if you've never read the book, you know about the prank, and you know about the rampage that she goes on. Um, oh, that was a bad one. Um, but I don't know anybody who doesn't know Carrie, or at least doesn't know about certain elements of Carrie. I mean, as I just said, even if you've never read the book, you know about the rampage that she goes on. And Carrie is kind of one of the more well-known characters. She's been adapted to film twice, so well, 2 feature-length films as well. Well, no, more than that, because there were 3 films. There was one in 1976 that was done by Brian De Palma. Then there was one that was made for television in 2002, I think. And then, of course, there was the 2013 version with Chloe Grace Moretz. I've actually seen all 3, and I like them all. They all have their own unique little visual styles and things like that. But there are also Broadway performances of this book or this story, which kind of kind of odd to me. In terms of when I read Carrie, my first impressions, I was very unsure. I didn't know. I'd seen the films, obviously, and the film adaptations are very true to the book. They stick, with the exception of the 2002 film, the film adaptations and the Broadway adaptations, they stick very close to the book. And as I said earlier, Carrie was, I read The Tommyknockers, which was the first Stephen King that I read. Carrie was, I think, the 6th, because the first one was The Tommyknockers, then it was Misery, then it was It, then Salem's Lot, then Cujo, and then Cycle of the Werewolf. So yeah, and then Carrie. So it was the 7th one in the 7th Stephen King novel that I'd read, and I genuinely had no idea what I was getting into. I've read a couple of female-led or novels that have a female main protagonist, and a lot of them have been really just fun and goofy, and you like everybody. But this was different. I read Carrie, and man, that was a trip. I've read it a couple of times now, but the first time I read it, man, that was a trip, and it's a trip every single time that I've read it. In terms of it's different from King's other stuff, but I've never related to a character as much as I did, as much as I related to the character of Carrie White. And I realize that sounds strange, so I will explain that. But it basically comes down to she's the social outcast. She's the weirdo in the school. She's being bullied all the time. The teachers don't really, they don't seem to do much. And I mean, it's frustrating because you see these teachers who are at least partially sympathetic. They go, oh, wow, this is inappropriate. Students shouldn't be behaving like this. So they want to help, but at the same time, they're kind of like joining in on the laughter in private, And I mean, Carrie is bullied something terrible, which was something that I went through at school. I think a lot of kids are bullied at school for a lot of different reasons. But growing up, I was largely homeschooled. But before I was homeschooled, I went through a couple of like actual schools, and I was bullied pretty much on every campus. I would have a few close friends on the campus, and the rest of the students either ignored me, and the ones who didn't ignore me would come around and push me around and call me names and beat me up a little bit. So I related to Carrie in that regard, because she hates being bullied. She is kind of she's resentful of that. These students are bullying her constantly, and the book starts out with them laughing at her. It says, if I remember correctly, the opening line is, they're laughing again, or something to that effect. And again, it's something that I went through as well, was people used to laugh at me because I wasn't as quick as the other students. I couldn't do the same things that the other students were doing. I could read and I could write, but I wasn't very good at maths. I wasn't really good at science. I couldn't play sports, because of my epilepsy. And at the time, my epilepsy was pretty much out of control, so I couldn't play sports. Or at least not the sports that everybody else was playing. I could play a little bit of soccer every once in a while, because I could actually catch a ball every now and again, but beyond that, it was kind of like, I'm more of a bookworm anyway. I kind of went, oh well, I'd rather read, which was kind of weird because most of the other boys on the ground on the campus grounds, would be playing soccer, or they'd be, talking about movies, or they'd be talking about this cartoon that they're watching. And then there's me sitting in the back corner with my nose in a book. So I was a very easy target, and that was very much the same thing with Carrie White. She's an easy target. I liked a couple of things. I had a couple of things that I liked and disliked. I like underdog stories. I've always kind of liked that idea of the person that you least expect, this social, the outcast character, the person that is, sort of shunned by their peers. They're not expected to amount to much, and then they develop these abilities, and it allows them to progress, and suddenly they're doing things that that they couldn't do before. And in the case of Carrie, she develops psychic abilities and goes looking to exact revenge on the people that had tormented her. Now, I mean, it's, in a way, it's almost the ultimate revenge fantasy. It's kind of like, we all kind of think about, well, oh, this person bullied me, this is what I want to do. But you don't actually go and do it. And this book kind of reads like that revenge fantasy of the socially awkward kind of outcast character who is constantly being bullied, who suddenly develops and goes a little bit bonkers. I like those kinds of stories. And to be fair, not all of them are revenge plots or revenge fantasy type things. I've always just liked underdog stories with characters who, in spite of the odds being against them in every possible way, they somehow figure out how to how to progress. So every hurdle that they get, they grit their teeth and they push through it, and in the end they are rewarded. They get to have their happy ending. They get to ride off into the proverbial sunset with a pretty girl at their side, or become successful businessmen or something like that, famous musicians or something. The tone of the book is something that I really liked as well, is that it stays consistent. It is dark pretty much every step of the way, and not like horror fantasy dark. Like, it's not like dark the same way that it was dark, because it was dark on a more personal level. I mean, as I said, I was someone who was bullied constantly when I was going to these proper schools. I was an easy target. I was much smaller than the other guys. I couldn't do what the other people were doing. I wasn't exactly very quick academically, so I was an easy target. And you read about a character who develops psychic powers and goes on a revenge mission. It is very dark because we see it not with psychic powers, obviously, but you see it a lot in the news. You'll see about um, school kids bringing guns to school, and bringing knives and things to school, and then getting into fights with them, going on a rampage because of this being pushed over the edge. And oh, so you are genuinely uncomfortable for the majority of the book. It doesn't matter if it's a quieter scene between Sue Snell and her boyfriend having a little chat about Carrie, or Carrie's crazy mother locking her in a closet. Yeah, you are genuinely uncomfortable throughout. Um, the the writing style was also something that I liked. King has this. It's a very visual style. It's something I noted when I did Andrea Kramer's Nightshade. Kramer has this thing where she'll describe everything in like minute detail, so that you have this exact picture of who these characters are. So she'll talk about, the color of Shay's eyes, and his scent, and all of this crazy stuff. And King is very much the same. It's something I noticed when I read it, was every scene comes to life. There was a sequence in it with, I think it was Eddie Kasprak, where he was crawling under this house. So the clown, Pennywise, was chasing him, crawling in the form of a mummy or a leper or something like that, and chasing this kid under a house. And I mean, I'd been uncomfortable throughout that book as well, but that chase sequence under the house on Nabald Street, man, I had chills. I didn't sleep that night. I read that chapter, that whole section, on a Friday night. I didn't, watch movies or listen to music. I sat reading it on a Friday night. I got through that scene, and I didn't sleep for at least a week and a half. So yeah, it's kind of weird, but King's writing style is incredibly visual. You know who each character is and what they look like, and you know what they're going through, and you know about the area that they're in. And I mean, it's sometimes, as in the case of Carrie, it can be very uncomfortable. Other times, such as in It, you are basically chewing your fingernails the whole time. I actually did, and I ended up biting into the skin of my finger, and basically bit a massive chunk out of my fingertip. So yeah. In terms of what I didn't like, well, let's go back to the writing style for a second. In addition to King's very visual writing style, Carrie was a very interesting read, because it's got a very interesting approach. it's written in the form of letters, and it's got this um, epistolary epistolary. I don't know why it took me so long to get that right. It has this epistolar. Oh man, epistolary structure. So it's um, newspaper articles and letters and police reports and like documents and things like that, talking about Carrie White and about the things that she did and the things that she went through. And I generally don't like that kind of thing. I've read a couple of books that are built like that, that are written like that. Bram Stoker's Dracula is a good example. And I mean, I enjoyed Dracula to a point, but that was a nightmare to get through for me. And there were some other books that I've tried to read that were built the same way, and I couldn't because they were just written very badly in this epistolary format. So I generated this kind of very strong dislike for the format. But in the case of Carrie, I was curious because everybody talked about how good the book was and how how uncomfortable it could make a person feel. And so I thought, well, I don't have anything else to read, so I may as well read Carrie. Like, obviously, I've got more than enough books to read, but Carrie was the one that everybody at the time was talking about. So I thought, well, I'll check it out. And I decided, well, okay, I don't normally read these types of books, so I'll try this one and see. And I actually really enjoyed it. I was really surprised. The approach, the epistolary approach, gives it this seriousness. You know, most of the time when you have something about someone who develops psychic powers and goes on a murderous, revenge-fueled rampage, it's very fantasy-oriented. It's a horror novel and a thriller and a fantasy and an adventure and so on. But it comes across as very hokey and very kind of, it doesn't have the kind of seriousness that Carrie does. If that makes sense. And unfortunately, that kind of brings an end to what I did like. With the exceptions of the characters of Sue Snell, Tommy Ross, Miss Desjardins, the one of the teachers, and I think it's the headmaster. There are only a few characters that are, not really it was Sue, Tommy, Desjardins, and obviously Carrie, but I hated all the other characters. Chris Hogginson, the lead bully, the one that kind of torments Carrie the worst, just delights in causing trouble. I was reading this book and going, how is this person, um, with her kind of history, because it's established that she has this history of misconduct. At one point, it says in the book that it's mentioned that she used a firecracker and almost took off a classmate's toes. I read that and I went, how is this kid not in jail? How is this person still a student in this school? She has no empathy. People talk about um, being psychopathic in nature, and that's kind of the character of Chris in a nutshell. And she doesn't see anything wrong. She has this thing where everybody else is wrong and she's always right. Her friends, her crew, her gang, whatever you want to call them, they're not much better. It's one of the few times that I wanted to actually throttle a character in a novel. And unfortunately, that's just how unlikable most of the characters were. I felt really bad for Sue Snell at the end of the book, because I felt like she kind of got the short end of the stick, in a way. Yeah, Carrie had it bad, but I think, and Desjardins, the teacher, yeah, she also kind of got a bit of a short end, a short stick. I think Sue probably got the worst of it, though. So I felt kind of bad for her, but beyond her and Tommy and Rita and Carrie, everybody else I hated. I couldn't stand these other characters. You've got a character who set off a firecracker and nearly cost a classmate her toes. She should be in a psych ward for the criminally insane, or some sort of juvenile detention center or something. And about the only reason I can think of that she's not in there is because her dad's a lawyer and he keeps covering up for her. Or like using his position as this high-end lawyer to keep her out of juvie, so she doesn't actually learn anything. Which kind of brings me to kind of a nitpick that I had with the book. It's mentioned, Billy Nolan is Chris Hogginson's boyfriend, and it's established pretty early on that he's having second thoughts. When they come up with the whole pig's blood idea, she kind of pushes him over the edge a little bit. He watches her kind of just go crazy, and he starts to think, well, maybe this isn't such a good idea. And so he's having these second thoughts, and he regrets his part. He doesn't like the fact that he had a part in Carrie's final breaking point. He regrets that. But why didn't he end the relationship and warn Carrie that his that Chris was on the warpath. You know, instead, he could have saved a lot of innocent people. He could have saved himself a lot of guilt for causing the deaths of tons of innocent people. He could have saved a lot of good lives, and instead, ends up getting killed while trying to kill Carrie. So if you're having second thoughts, and this is something that I've seen a couple of times on social media, you'll get it every now and again, that look, if you're having trouble in a relationship, don't break up with them, and kind of just stick it out and work on solving the problem. But in this, and to a point, I understand where that's coming from. But at the same time, if your partner is abusing you or being abusive, throwing you around, beating you up, doing anything and everything they can just to make you miserable, well, then you leave. That's common sense. Nolan is having second thoughts about his relationship with this completely psychotic girl, but he doesn't act on it. He just kind of goes along for the ride. And, it doesn't, it doesn't make sense. The next thing that kind of irritated me was Carrie's mother. Is she mentally unhinged? Is she actually legitimately crazy? Or is she just cruel for cruelty's sake? Because, you're looking at a character who looks at, at Carrie getting her first period as being some sort of curse, and that Carrie must have committed some sort of sin, and she has to be locked away in a cupboard to pray and that kind of thing, and ask for forgiveness, and and that's most of the time, is that she is this kind of crazy person for the majority of the book. But then she gets these kind of moments where she's very lucid and she can actually, talk logically. She explains at one point that psychokinetic abilities kind of runs in the family. And it's these moments of lucidity that kind of throw me off, because if you are genuinely as mentally unhinged as Margaret White is, then how do you become lucid enough, once or twice to say something logical? It's these moments of lucidity that kind of bring up the question, okay, are you genuinely crazy, or are you just being cruel for the sake of being cruel? Because when she talks about Carrie's abilities, she mentions that it runs in the family, and that it sometimes will skip a generation. Which kind of brings up this interesting idea of, she talks about Carrie being conceived through marital rape, and how, the psychic ability runs in the family, but sometimes it'll skip a generation. So, is she mentally unhinged, or is she just cruel for the sake of being cruel? Is she does she resent the fact that that she ended up pregnant with Carrie? Does she resent the fact that she gave birth to Carrie? You know, is she jealous of Carrie's psychic abilities? You know, these psychokinetic abilities. Is she jealous of her daughter's powers? You know, because that would make sense to me. You know, if she is mentally insane, and it's kind of implied that when her husband, you know, forced himself on her and Carrie was conceived that way, it kind of messed with her head a little bit. But at the same time, it also makes a lot of sense that if psychic abilities run in your family, you know, your mother had it and her mother had it, but it sometimes will skip a generation and it skips you, but it passes on to your daughter, then it kind of becomes, well, why are you so cruel? You know, this is your daughter, your flesh and blood, and you are making her life a living hell. So why? For what reason? And it's never fully explained whether or not she is mentally, like, fully insane, although that's kind of implied towards the end, that she's just snapped. Her sanity is completely gone, and Carrie is this demonic thing to her. But how much of that is insanity and how much of it is cruelty? Because if she's jealous of her daughter's abilities, well then, you know, she would do pretty much anything to bring her daughter down. That's kind of how it reads to me, is that she's either completely crazy or she's jealous of her daughter's abilities, or both. And I honestly can't say which is which. So, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily something that I didn't like about the book. It's just something that it irritated me a little bit. And yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a nitpick. It's kind of just it's something. It's not necessarily something that I disliked. I mean, it works. It works for the story, but you know, I don't know. It just didn't sit right with me. You know, I would have liked to know if she was jealous or not. It is kind of implied. I feel like it is kind of implied that she is jealous of Carrie. But it would have been nice to get that concrete, like, yes, she's jealous of her daughter for having these powers. You know. Anyway, would I recommend the book? You know what? I probably would. As odd as it sounds, this is definitely one of Stephen King's. It's not as it's not as polished as some of his later works, but you have to keep in mind that this was his very first novel. And so it is a little bit rough around the edges. It is very difficult to read. But if you can sort of grit your teeth and push through it, it is well worth reading. And yeah, so I would definitely recommend it if you like the epistolary structure, then great, you know. If not, well then, yeah, it might be a little harder to read if you're not really into this kind of thing. But yeah, I would definitely recommend it. It's not perfect. There are problems with it. Like I said, it was Stephen King's debut novel. Of course, it's going to be a little rough around the edges. So, you know, you can't. There's no such thing as a perfect novel, and I think every author kind of knows that. But that said, even with all its rough edges, Carrie is definitely worth a read. And if you get the chance, then definitely pick up a copy and read it, because as hard as it is to read, and as uncomfortable as it will make you, and as unlikable as the characters are, it's worth reading. And you might feel sick at some points, but, you know, it's worth it. It's actually genuinely worth reading. So, I've said it already, I'm going to say it again. If you have a chance, then definitely pick up a copy. If you haven't read the book, pick up a copy and read it, because it is definitely worth your while. It's hard to read. It's painful to read, especially if you're like me and you were bullied a lot as a kid. Then yeah, it will be a very painful read. But you get through it, and it's well worth it. So check it out if you're interested. I hope I didn't spoil the book too much for those of you who haven't read it. And speaking of having read the book or not, I want to kind of reach out and ask you, the viewer of the video, have you read the book? Have you read Carrie? And if so, what did you think of it? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Why or why not? Would you recommend the book to someone? And again, why would you recommend it, or why wouldn't you recommend it? You know, drop that in the comment section below. Below, you know, down there. That's where the comment section is. Anyway, drop that stuff in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I certainly had a hard time reading the book, but I enjoyed it. I haven't done a review video that is this long for a while, so it was nice to actually just sit in front of a camera and really get into a book review. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys for the next video. Cheers.